Welcome to What I Watched This Month, 1-minute reviews of each movie I saw this month. I will be discussing the overall premise of most movies, but will not reveal any crucial ending spoilers. Mother Night is an adaptation of Kurt Vonnegut's novel about Howard Campbell, a writer who is begrudgingly recruited as an American spy to encode hidden messages in the Nazi propaganda he broadcasts. Now that the war is over, the Americans will not claim him as theirs for fear of revealing their espionage methods, so as far as anyone knows, he's just another war criminal. I like what Roger Ebert said in his review of the film. The dilemma Vonnegut sets the main character is that he cannot jump off the ship it was convenient for him to sail through the war on. At one point, Campbell is confronted with the question of whether he'd have been content to live in prosperity under Nazi regime had the Germans won, and truth be told, he probably would have. It's easy to skate by on convenience in the face of evil. Last month, I criticized the 2020 film The Hunt for, maybe, advocating a just-take-care-of-yourself attitude to politics, and here, Campbell tried to do just that, but ended up doing much more in self-preservation, and now he doesn't even have the comfort of knowing he was following his conscience. The film's absurd side characters are less engaging than its more philosophical moments, but it's a solid adaptation. Pather Panchali is the first in a trilogy of Indian films about a young boy named Apu growing up in a very poor family. The film gets praised for highlighting small daily joys that can be found even in poverty, but for me, Apu's mother is the emotional center of the movie, and she is constantly visibly feeling the strain of their poverty. She has to field the neighbors' accusations of her children stealing from them, she is forever aware of all the debts they owe, she begs her husband to ask for his back pay from his employer, and even to consider moving away from his ancestral home to a more lucrative location. The film is slow and thoughtful, filled with long shots of people doing their daily work, or, for the children, playing with their friends. The use of music is especially striking, as several times during heightened emotional scenes, the sound of dialogue just drops altogether and is replaced with only the score. This is especially effective during one scene when a distraught character's cries are mimicked by the wailing of the instrument. It does take work to get through. I wasn't fully engaged until about 2/3 of the way through, but it's ultimately easy to see why the film is acclaimed, even if it's not an instant favorite. The Duel is a Western starring Liam Hemsworth as a ranger hired to find out who is killing Mexicans and dumping their bodies in the river. The evidence points to a creepy cult leader played by Woody Harrelson, who just so happens to be the man who killed Hemsworth's father years ago. This movie is trying to be a lot of things: a takedown of predatory religion, a commentary on vigilante justice, a lesson on the historical relationship between New Mexico and the US and Texas, but it doesn't do any of those things very well. These aspects all flit in and out of the picture inconsistently based on how convenient they are. What is Harrelson's religion he's preaching that keeps his town enthralled? I haven't the faintest idea, but hey, there's snake handling, so you know it's bad? What does this movie think of vigilante justice? Who knows? It doesn't actually come up until the ham-fisted monologue at the end. How is racism intertwined with this narrative? Well, we'll never really know, because the only non-white person whose story gets even partly told just abruptly loses all agency partway through the film and is then abandoned with no resolution. The script feels so rushed. It definitely needed a few more edits to achieve thematic cohesion genre. Naked Lunch is a surreal movie based on the equally surreal novel by William S. Burroughs. Both book and film follow a man who, under the influence of drugs, believes himself to be some sort of agent receiving secret messages and missions. The film combines the loose plot of the book with a meta-plot wherein the main character is Burroughs writing the Naked Lunch novel in and among his altered reality. I found the novel insufferable, but the movie much less so. Some of it has to do with the fact that added visuals make it so much easier to pull a narrative together and even just follow what might be going on. The surrealism is strong here, but it contributes to the atmosphere in a way that it didn't for me on the written page. Of course, the atmosphere it contributes to is not a pleasant one. Director David Cronenberg excels at wielding body horror in a way that's not just disgusting, but unsettling down to the core. Critic reviews of the film frequently reference its bleakness and pessimism, and I'd have to agree. It is a wildly depressing film, and not one that I could fathom watching again, or even really recommending to anyone, even if it is technically done well. Heaven Knows What is a Safdie brothers film showing a few days in the life of a homeless drug addict named Harley. She bounces from person to person, asking for rent money or negotiating for her next fix, but always inevitably circling back to her exceptionally cruel and abusive boyfriend, who, it is hinted, is the one who introduced her to drugs in the first place. It's a brutal and unforgiving film that left me in a deep funk after I finished it. It is that depressing. It's based on the real-life experiences of Ariel Holmes, who the Safdie brothers met while she was living on the streets, and they were working on what would become Uncut Gems. Holmes, in fact, plays Harley here, and lends a layer of authenticity that makes it even more upsetting to watch. She speaks in an interview about essentially scheduling her drug usage around the scenes she was filming. Holmes did enter rehab after the film, and from what I can tell, she has remained clean since then. The film is a far cry from the elaborate plot threads in Good Time or Uncut Gems, but it hits much harder emotionally. It's a devastating watch, but probably one worth seeing. Just be prepared for it. The Hills Have Eyes is a classic horror movie by Wes Craven, and one that was a huge blind spot for me up until now. It tells the story of a family whose car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, and they find themselves at the mercy of the strange... family? Cult? It's a group of murderous people living together in the hills. Very little information is given to us about this group. We get a sort of backstory about halfway through the film, but it's still never clear what these people want, or how far their power extends, or a lot of other things. But hey, we fear what we don't understand, and the film really leans into the horror of regular people wanting to know why are they even doing this, and it's a pretty effective angle. It has the same grody, uncomfortable visual feel as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was one of Craven's favorite films, and you can absolutely see its influence here, not only in the grunginess of its visuals, but also in how generally unlikable its protagonists are. It's definitely not my preferred subgenre for horror, but it does exactly what it's trying to do, and I've got to give it props for that. 5 centimeters per second is a film about a young boy and girl who are best friends in elementary school but move away from each other at age 13. The film is divided into 3 segments that follow how this short-lived relationship sticks with the boy at different points in his life. It clocks in at a brief 60 minutes, and that's about the perfect length for this. Much longer and there'd be a higher risk of the film losing its carefully crafted emotional tone. Director Makoto Shinkai has a way of bringing out the big picture in his work, making his themes feel enormous, universal, while still focusing on a singular narrative. Here there's this sprawling sense of longing and searching, and it's powerful. The score here definitely helps too. It is absolutely stunning. It grounds the film and gives it an immediate weight, a sense that this story is bigger than you think it is at first. It's one of those films that feel almost more like a painting than cinema, beautiful and still, and the longer you think about it, the more you start pondering those big universal questions. If you're familiar with Your Name, Shinkai's recent hit, there's no sci-fi in this one, but it feels equally resonant. The Informer follows an Irish man in Dublin who informs on one of his former IRA buddies to get the reward money so he and his girlfriend can go to America. His friend is caught and, in his attempt to escape, is shot and killed. The movie then follows the Informer throughout the rest of the night as guilt and suspicion haunt him. Watching this character is frequently infuriating. He's depicted as someone not particularly bright, and not only does he not think through his plan to inform on his friend, but once he does, he can't take it. He fluctuates wildly between extreme paranoia, where he becomes violent at any mention of the police, and overconfident security, where he recklessly spends all the money he betrayed his conscience to get. The film's director, John Ford, had a long career directing silent films before venturing into talkies, and there's a definite silent melodrama feel to this movie, with many early sections having no dialogue or sound at all, other than the score. The film does ask some interesting questions about forgiveness and personal responsibility, and the cinematography is striking, but you will have to get past the melodramatic acting and narrative style, which is sometimes easier said than done. Hustlers tells the story of a group of strippers whose club starts floundering in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, so they come up with a scheme in which they drug CEOs and stock traders, lure them into their club, and then run up their credit card purchases to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars. The film itself creates multiple comparisons between these women and skeezy Wall Street traders, and this film feels very much like a Wolf of Wall Street style heist biopic, that high-flying, high-energy kind of journey, albeit with genders swapped and more emphasis on the personal connection between the hustlers. Jennifer Lopez has gotten a lot of praise for her performance here, and deservedly so. She manages to pull off being both ruthless and charming, and from moment to moment, the adoration she heaps on her young proteges can switch from feeling maternal to feeling predatory. I admire a film that's bold enough to have such a strong female-centric cast. Not only does it pass the Bechdel test with flying colors, but it might not pass a reverse test. I'm not sure there are 2 men in here who have a conversation with each other not about women. The movie feels like a refreshing take on a well-worn genre. Worth a watch. My Darling Clementine is a western in which the character the movie is named after technically exists, but has absolutely zero bearing on the plot. The movie is actually about Wyatt Earp becoming Tombstone's marshal, befriending Doc Holliday, and attempting to find the man who murdered his brother. I seldom feel more out of sync with the rest of the movie criticism world than when watching a western. This film is regarded as one of Ford's very best, but it doesn't hold together for me. I found the script to be strange and sloppy. For example, at one point Doc Holliday tells someone to leave town or I will. They don't. He confronts them to tell them fine, he's leaving because they won't, and then Earp corners him to tell him he can't run people out of town. But he isn't. He's just leaving instead. The whole script feels like this. I kept finding myself deeply frustrated by how dumb it made the characters sound, and I don't think that was the intention. And it's a small thing, but the title really doesn't make sense. Clementine isn't the catalyst for any single thing in the plot. Given how loved this film is, it must have its merits, but I can't find them. There isn't a satisfying through line or really anything that holds my interest. Asterix and Cleopatra is my 100th movie I've watched from 1968, and it's not a particularly strong one to end the challenge on. It's based on a French-language comic series popular in the 1960s. My dad grew up reading them, so we had a few of them around our house growing up. This particular one features the series protagonists, Asterix and Obelix, voyaging to Egypt to help a terrible architect build a palace to impress Cleopatra. This is most definitely a film and comic series for kids, with the characters being defined by single traits, and the jokes being basically that one trait used over and over again. The use of racial caricatures in this video in particular has definitely not aged well, but the musical numbers are fun and there are a few enjoyably absurdist moments. It was strange how much of the series came back to me as I watched the film, but it was better as a nostalgia vehicle for me than as a film in and of itself. The plot kind of bounces all over the place in a way that makes total sense for a kid's cartoon, but feels aimless to me as an adult. If it weren't for those racial caricatures, I'd recommend it for kids, but as it is, I'm happy to just let it sit in the vault. Alright, now that I've watched 100 movies from 1968, my random number generator has chosen my next year for this project, and it has gone with 1994. I have 52 movies to watch to get to 100, so we're starting with Il Postino, an Italian film about an aimless young man in a poor village who befriends poet Pablo Neruda and ends up falling in love with poetry and a woman along the way. The first two-thirds of this movie are a charming little comedy drama, structured almost like a coming-of-age story, and then the final third takes a turn I wasn't expecting, in what the character does with the lessons they've learned after that formative experience goes away or changes. My favorite parts are by far the conversations Neruda and young Mario have about language and love and metaphors, and while I'm not as wowed by the final third, I think it is necessary. It grounds the film back in reality, where Mario lives, rather than pretending that living perpetually in the abstract is a reality for most people. It's a sweet and thoughtful movie that was a great kickoff to widening my knowledge of 1994 in film. The Rainmaker is a romantic drama based on a play of the same name. I was loosely familiar with the story as the basis for the musical 110 in the Shade. I've heard the cast album but haven't seen the show, but frankly, it's hard to imagine a show with a revival as recent as 2007 being this antiquated in its views of women. Burt Lancaster plays a con artist promising rain to farms and drought, and Katharine Hepburn plays the perpetual old maid desperate for love who, I don't know, learns how to dream because Lancaster tells her she's beautiful. Hepburn got an Oscar nomination for this performance, but it is one of the most unflattering portrayals of older single women I think I've ever seen. It makes her fragile and pitiable for the sole reason that she isn't married. Hepburn excels at portraying bold, independent characters, and that would have been so much more interesting. The film is maybe trying to say some things about ambition and about being willing to fight for what you want, but it all gets drowned out by the deliberate on-screen patheticness of this character who apparently just needs a man to bestow upon her her sense of purpose. What a terrible character to put at the center of your film. Legends of the Fall tells the story of three brothers and their father on a remote Montana ranch, and the woman that all three brothers fall in love with. Much of the film focuses on the conflicted relationship between the careful, responsible oldest son, played by Aidan Quinn, and the wild and violent middle son, played by Brad Pitt. It's the kind of film that jumps ahead years at a time to give a sprawling sense of this family's overarching drama. Brad Pitt is more likable than he has any right to be given how his character is written, but I found myself more intrigued by Quinn's character's struggle with doing the right thing when his brother can make horrific mistakes, and yet, to quote Quinn, "Everyone still loved you more." The movie loves him more too. It pushes us heavily to sympathize with Pitt and scorn Quinn, but it never quite convinced me. I would have appreciated the film more if it had centered the brothers wholly and cut the love triangle that keeps fighting to be the movie's focus. Julia Ormond is sorely underused here. There's no denying that the film does look lovely with grandiose sweeping landscape shots, but the film frequently feels overstuffed. There are two film versions of Terence Madigan's play, the Browning version. I watched this one from 1994, which stars Albert Finney as a classical languages teacher who is forced into retirement. The film follows him over his final 2 days at the school, in which he must come to terms with how many ways he feels he has failed. His students all dislike him, his wife is cheating on him with another teacher, and the school not only forces him into retirement, but also continually demonstrates how little respect they've ever had for him and his work. When this film works, it's on the strength of Albert Finney's performance. He does such an excellent job of showing this character's pride in his work and how deeply hurt he is as he realizes how little his efforts have meant to anyone around him. As a teacher who also teaches a subject she's passionate about, a lot of his wrestling with that hit very hard. But he is really the only good part of this film, as much of the rest of it is alternately bland and preachy, and the ending would be entirely unsatisfying were it not for Finney managing to bring some believability to his final monologue, which really doesn't earn it. Maybe worth a watch for his performance, but otherwise, nah. Suddenly Last Summer is a full-length adaptation of a one-act Tennessee Williams play. Katharine Hepburn plays an exceptionally wealthy woman who promises Montgomery Clift $1 million for his state asylum if he does a lobotomy on her niece, who lost her mind after witnessing the death of her cousin, Hepburn's son. Clift is less convinced that she needs such a drastic treatment, and the mystery unfolds. This film definitely feels like a play. That's not necessarily a negative for me, but there are long monologues where characters describe more dramatic scenes. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The crowning jewel here is Hepburn, who dominates the first and final thirds of the film and radiates icy possessiveness. The way she speaks of her deceased son is just cloying at first, and then downright ominous the more the story plays out. The cinematography is dramatic, but usually effective. Once Elizabeth Taylor enters the picture, I found myself less interested. The niece is not nearly as interesting a character, and her big descriptive monologue at the film's climax is one of the ones that doesn't work. It's very Tennessee Williams and very theatrical, but it definitely has its moments, and it's probably worth checking out. I finally saw the version of Little Women that all my peers loved growing up. If you somehow don't know the story, it's about 4 sisters and their mother growing up poor during the American Civil War, mostly centering on the headstrong sister Jo, who is frustrated at how narrow her life options are as a woman. At its best, the story oozes warmth and welcome and a strong sense of family love despite ups and downs, and this definitely hits all those notes. The cast is all good, with special nods to Winona Ryder as Jo and Susan Sarandon as their mother. I think I'm realizing, however, after watching both this and the Greta Gerwig version this year, that this just isn't a story that resonates with me. I don't relate particularly well to any of the characters, it doesn't spark bigger ideas within me, no iteration of it unveils new layers, and on the whole it works for me better as a cozy, mindless watch than as something that actually draws me in. And it always has that weird anti-genre fiction thread running through it. There's nothing to complain about here, really. It's a solid, warm, cozy movie, but nothing much beyond that. If you loved the original story, you'll probably really enjoy this. Tallulah stars Ellen Page as a homeless woman who finds herself unexpectedly babysitting a toddler for a clearly unfit mother, and when left with the choice to return the child to the mom or not, she chooses not. Instead, she kidnaps it, finds her former boyfriend's mother, played by Allison Janney, and convinces her the baby is her grandchild. A lot of indie dramas have deeply flawed characters trying to find their way in the world, but we as the audience are often meant to at least sympathize with their struggle, even if we disagree with their choices. This film bizarrely treats every character aside from maybe Janney with a kind of deep contempt. It provides multiple opportunities for audience stand-ins to coldly lecture Paige and the mom on their choices and builds up an incredibly shamey vibe. And on top of that, the narrative itself runs out of steam and resolves abruptly, with characters overcoming their inner demons with no justification whatsoever, like they just ran out of time and now they had to be fulfilled. Paige and Janney turn in some quality performances and make these characters almost likable despite how judgily they're portrayed, but it is a clunky mess of a film. Stage Door follows a group of young actresses all rooming together in a boarding house in New York. It especially focuses on 2, Ginger Rogers, who is snarky and jaded, and Katharine Hepburn, who is snarky and optimistic. We follow the various women's ups and downs, auditions, performances, rejections, boyfriends, squabbles, and how they each take them in stride. The dialogue here is the most delightful kind of witty banter. Nearly every exchange functions as either playful teasing or a pointed jab, and the two can alternate frequently within a scene as dynamics between characters shift. Some more serious drama does arise near the end, as one woman has to contend with the unexpected results of elbowing her way to the top, but the film isn't trying to make much of a statement about it, other than perhaps art is very hard, and it's content to let it sit there. This feels like a film that would live up to multiple rewatches and deep dives into individual characters. Honestly, I feel like I barely scratched the surface in a single viewing. There is a lot to appreciate here, and I definitely recommend it, especially if you're a fan of any of the actresses involved. My final movie of September was Village of the Damned, a British horror movie about a small town where the women all fall mysteriously pregnant and then give birth to children with supernatural powers. This movie has one of the creepiest opening scenes I've ever seen on film, and the rest doesn't quite live up to those expectations, but it's still solid. It's very short, at just 75 minutes long, and ends up functioning even better as a series of unsettling, unexplained encounters than it does as one long narrative. I had to do some Googling at one point to find out if the main child had been dubbed by an adult woman the way it sounds, but no, that was just the child doing his own voice. It just sounds so unnatural, it brings out the horror atmosphere in full force. The central character struck a realistic balance for me between being eager to study these new creatures and being cautious of them, especially as he begins to see how they intend to use their powers. I knew very little about this film before watching it, but it is definitely an underrated gem. If you like your horror light on gore and heavy on eerie atmosphere, I definitely think you should give this one a watch.